It's no secret that today many Christians feel disoriented when it comes to understanding the relationship between faith and politics. And much of this confusion comes from the fact that we've adopted a modern conception of freedom. So, to the modern mind, freedom refers to the ability to do whatever you want. But what if that assumption is wrong? Well, Brad Littlejohn joins us to talk about his new book on Christian freedom, to help us understand how Christianity provides a concept of freedom that's not only true, but beneficial for the common good. And so we talk about Christian freedom as it relates to religious liberty and how it informs the way that we view technology and how it can shape a society for good and ill, as well as many other topics. I hope you enjoy this episode. We've got Brad Littlejohn on the show again. We had an interview with him a while back on Richard Hooker, and that was a great time. So we had such a great time that we want him to come back on the show with us. Brad is a fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's also the founder of the Davidan Institute and served for a decade as their president, and he continues to teach in various capacities for them. And we're excited to have him back on the show. Brad, welcome.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've written a book that I think is really, really impactful, and I certainly enjoyed reading it. It's called Called to Freedom, Retrieving Christian Liberty in an Age of License, and that'll be coming out on January the 15th, right around the new year. And what I appreciate about this book is that, it's short. It's about 152 pages, at least the copy that I have. It seemed pretty short and concise. But I also appreciated how there's so much division and tension and anxiety over the topic of politics, especially in the church today. And I appreciated how you sort of took a step back to really talk conceptually, to focus on clear definitions, concepts, and a grounded look at history. So I found that to be really helpful in your work. And I'm curious, just in you personally, as you think as an author, as your book comes out in a time of great political division in America and the church, what role do you hope your book plays in modern discussions in the church regarding politics?
Yeah, I think the way to think about this is, maybe it's an overused metaphor, but you can have currents or you can have waves on the surface that look, if you're a boat floating along, if you're in a small boat, it can seem like the waves on the surface are the big deal. You're being kind of tossed around by the waves. The waves can seem to be going in one direction based on where the wind is blowing. But there could be a current underneath that's moving in a different direction, and that is actually the much, much greater force of water than the little waves on the surface. And if you're just distracted by the waves on the surface, you may not notice at all where the current is pulling you. And I think that is very much the case for how evangelical Christians have thought about or failed to think about politics over just at least the last generation. I haven't been around long enough to complain about the last century, so we'll stick with the problems of my own lifetime. But certainly in my lifetime, Christians have often been very exercised about politics and about the ways in which, and I would say, first of all, they're not wrong to be, right? So this is not going to be one of those. I'm not one of those. We just all need to take a step back and calm down and just to agree to disagree and focus on eternal things. No. Our laws really do matter and shape who we are as a people. But the problem is that so much Christian engagement with these questions has been very kind of ad hoc, reactive, focused on what's happening on the surface and not necessarily focused on what's happening underneath the surface in terms of what are the assumptions that both parties are sharing in common and that are just dictating the terms of the conversation. What are the assumptions that the church is sharing and is reinforcing in its own teaching, even when it might seem to, at one level, it openly opposes certain policies, and yet it subconsciously encourages the same trends. And I think a lot of this revolves around how we think about freedom, and that's what I'm really wrestling with in the book. So, for instance, I think most, pretty much all conservative pastors would recognize the problems with the transgender movement, and they would say this is something Christians should oppose, and we should oppose it openly in public. I mean, they have different strategies of engagement. Some would emphasize, we need to be more winsome. Others would say we need to be more combative. But they would kind of all agree Christians need to impose the transgender movement in their public statements, in the political realm, et cetera, et cetera. But many, and similarly also on abortion, right? They would say you do not have the freedom to choose what gender you are. You do not have the freedom to choose whether to end a life or not. That's a wrong understanding of freedom. It is simply not the case that my body equals my choice. But at the same time, I think many churches have encouraged a way of thinking about freedom that does kind of default to a kind of my body, my choice. We use rhetoric around Christian liberty, for instance. We're like, oh, well, this is a Christian liberty issue. My pastor shouldn't speak to it. I used to be at a church that was really legalistic, that was really concerned with, what we did with our bodies and blah, 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 blah. But now, now I understand that, this church is great because it teaches, this is the Christian liberty, and that the gospel is all about love and acceptance, or whatever, right? So you can have churches that say all that, and they would still be like, oh yeah, but of course, abortion is wrong, transgenderism is wrong, right? And it's, and you see, and you're just like, this is incoherent. Don't you realize that you are embracing this way of thinking about freedom and law that leads directly to the kind of cultural malformations that you're opposing?
I think that's something that you point out in your book, even just thinking about modern politics, and you think about those initial sort of upper waves. I just finished watching about a year ago. I watched The West Wing for the first time, and I was struck where I'm like, President Bartlett's policies are essentially just what the GOP would be today. It's kind of like an odd thing, and I do feel like in the sort of the discourse popularly, there's this sense of like, even when people rail against, wokeness and all those kind of progressive ideas, they rail against it because it violates freedom, their freedom to say whatever they want. And so even in their opposition, right, there's a sense of, there's already an agreed upon definition of freedom that seems like it's, I guess, more of a modern conception. And so I think in your book, you're trying to say, okay, let's go back and actually, let's define our terms. What do we mean by freedom? And I think I've seen that in churches as well, even with something like, it's probably true that for Republican candidates in the next few elections, you can't be opposed to same-sex marriage and be a viable candidate. That might already be a reality. I don't know. But I have heard, Christians who would say, I think homosexuality is wrong, but, the state should stay out of marriage, right, because it violates freedom to tell people they can't marry somebody. And so I definitely have heard that. And if we want to go underneath the waves to the currents underneath and talk about some of the more fundamental issues, how should we understand the nature of freedom, classically understood? How do we go back to the roots and say, when we talk about freedom, this is how we should conceptualize it?
Yeah. So in the opening chapter, I map out the concept of freedom in 3 dimensions. So one is in relation to the distinction political philosophers often use between negative and positive freedom. Another is individual versus corporate or institutional freedom. And another is, I'm just blanking. Oh, yes. Yeah. Inner versus outward freedom. So, just very briefly on each of those, the positive versus negative. Negative, I think, is how we most often talk about freedom now. It's this idea of just being sort of left alone, not interfered with. Nobody is constraining you, therefore you're free. That's clearly not adequate as a full account of freedom, because, by that token, we could say, the paraplegic is free to walk because nobody's holding them down. Well, No, they're free of being, their walking is not being interfered with by an outside force, but they don't have the capacity to walk. So there has to be some kind of positive capacity. And within that idea of positive freedom is also often the idea of a kind of directionality or purpose, that toward which you're using your freedom. So sometimes people say so freedom for or freedom to is positive liberty, as opposed to freedom from, which is negative liberty. And it's a useful distinction. I think it's sometimes an overused distinction. It doesn't cover all the terrain that we need to talk about, but it's a useful starting point. We can also think about, let me do the inward and outward, can sort of relate to that, so that outward liberty is our sort of freedom of action in the world. It's what we can do with our bodies. But inward freedom is the freedom of the mind, of the heart, that lies behind that, and that is much more fundamental. Now, and it's that freedom, that inward freedom, can coexist with outward unfreedom. This is what many political prisoners have discovered. We find it very inspirational when we read this literature of somebody who was like locked up in a cell, and nonetheless, wrote some amazing book or diary, or in which it's clear that although their body may be in captivity, their soul is not. They still hold firmly to what they believe, and they can even maybe find a kind of solace and experience of freedom, of knowing that, especially for Christians who have the sense of, I am still free in relation to God, however much my external actions may be confined. So that inward freedom is really the foundation for any durable outward freedom. You can't. I say you can have inward freedom without outward freedom. You can't have outward freedom without inward freedom, or not as a human being, right? I mean, a robot is free to move around, but it's not really free, because we would say it's not actually self-propelled by a will. So that inward freedom precedes outward freedom. I also talk about the distinction between individual and corporate or institutional freedom. The idea that, and this is one where I think our discourse is very distorted now, is we tend to think of freedom as something only possessed by an individual. Not absolutely. We still, we'll talk about a free country, talk about the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom, and we recognize, at least in our better moments, I think, that we don't just mean, when we say the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, we don't just mean the Ukrainians are fighting so that each individual Ukrainian can do whatever they want. We're saying, no, the freedom of Ukraine as a nation. So there can be a way in which a corporate entity can have a corporate personality, corporate agency, that has its own freedom that has to be fought for. And certainly that's the case on a smaller scale. The freedom of a family, freedom of a church as a community, the freedom of a school, that is it's not just the freedom of the individuals within it. And in fact, it can be in tension with the freedom of the individuals within it, at least the way we sometimes think about that, right? If I want to have the freedom to participate in congregational singing, that means that I don't just have the freedom to sing whatever song comes into my head when I'm there in the worship service, right? We give up the freedom to choose what to sing. Somebody chooses for us. But by giving up that individual freedom, we experience the corporate freedom of singing together. So that's a really key dimension of it. And together, kind of putting all this together, I give a kind of succinct definition of freedom as the capacity for meaningful action. And so sort of capacity emphasizes it's got to have that positive dimension as well as negative. Action emphasizing there's real kind of the will and the reason are operative. Human beings are capable of action, we would say properly, in a way that animals don't. Animals do things, but they don't participate in action because they don't have a rational will. And it has to be meaningful, which means it can't be, things are meaningful only in relation to a community. Right? I don't enjoy free speech if I'm, the only American among a bunch of Eskimos, because they don't understand what the heck I'm saying. Right. So, a community of shared meaning, and thus a context of institutional or corporate freedom, is actually necessary for me to have freedom of action as an individual.
So I think that's a really good observation, especially about when you talk about the tension of, or it doesn't have to be tension, but there are tensions between the sort of the individual freedom and the sense of corporate freedom. Um, Especially today, most people think about freedom as the ability to do whatever you want as an individual, to self-actualize whatever kind of conception you have of, whatever you want to be. And as long as you don't ruin someone else's ability to do that, it's like everything's fair game. But it does miss the communal aspect of, like, there are common goods that we have to seek together that do require the sacrificing of some of our freedoms. And you do speak a lot about the theological underpinnings. I mean, you mentioned about the freedom that a Christian has before God. And I'm curious about when you talk about shared values and even having a transcendent point of origin for morality. You hear a lot about discourse about that. Does it have to be Christian, though? Could it just be sort of a deistic God and a deistic kind of sense of a higher power? Or is there something uniquely Christian that undergirds all of this?
Yeah, I think, the answer is to some extent both. I want to say that this fuller concept of freedom that I'm recovering is in part a classical heritage. It's not uniquely Christian. It's going back to things that the pagans understood, and that we've, something like everybody understood until, fairly recently, perhaps, to paint with a broad brush. But there are also aspects that I would say are uniquely Christian. And the way to put this together is that chapters 2 through 4 of the book, I go through 3 different kinds of freedom: spiritual freedom, moral freedom, and political freedom. And, starting with the latter two, what I say is, political freedom ultimately depends upon moral freedom. And this is getting to the insight of the American founders, that, like, our government, a free government, requires a self-governing people. So if you want a government by the people, then those people need to be capable of governing themselves as individuals if they're going to govern themselves as a community. People who don't know how to govern their own passions as individuals are not, when you put them all together in a multitude, suddenly going to be great at governing their passions as a multitude. Quite the opposite. And so you have to have developed a moral freedom that is the mastery over your passions, mastering yourself rather than being mastered by yourself. That is, ultimately a prerequisite to durable political freedom. Otherwise, you're going to have anarchy, or you're going to need a very kind of totalitarian regime to keep people in line if they're not keeping themselves in line. And that, I should say, that totalitarianism doesn't have to look like, jackboots and the SS or whatever. It can be subtle. And I think, there are ways in which our own government is totalitarian in subtle ways. We live in a very surveillance-based society. There are all kinds of ways in which our behavior is carefully monitored and nudged and manipulated, both by, I should say, government actors and private actors, as a way of sort of keeping us in line, because we are not effective at self-governing. We haven't cultivated moral freedom. Now, that idea of moral freedom that I talk about in chapter 3, I use Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, and I say, like, the best of the ancient Greek and Romans understood a lot about this idea of moral freedom, and how to cultivate it, how to have a well-ordered soul. So you don't need Christianity for that, absolutely, but you do in another sense, because paganism is not actually able to achieve what it aspires to. There's not for all the pagans' search for self-mastery, there is ultimately, we can't be sufficient in ourselves. We are dependent upon something higher, which is to say, God, and we can't overcome our sin. We have to be freed from that sin. And so basically the attempt to become, what the pagans give us is the attempt to become a virtuous person by disciplining your passions. And that's good. It's better to attempt to be a virtuous person than not to attempt to be a virtuous person. But you'll never, you'll You'll get some ways, but you won't get all the way. You'll still be a sinful person. And if you think that your only hope is in yourself, then you'll really still be in a kind of slavery of soul, where you'll be enslaved by the fear of death and judgment, right? All of us are haunted by the fear of death and by the knowledge that at death we might face some judgment. And so we'd better get it right. And it's the freedom from that condemnation that is the most foundational freedom of all that Christianity offers. And I would say Protestant Christianity offers in its clearest form. So spiritual freedom is about doctrine of justification by faith, whereby we are set free from the burden of having to make ourselves righteous. Having been set free from that burden, we're then actually much more capable of pursuing genuine virtue. So we're able to pursue moral freedom better when we know that it's not all on us to do it, when we can lean upon the Spirit. So putting all that together, what you get is you need some level of moral freedom to have political freedom. To have the fullest level of moral freedom, you actually need spiritual freedom. So from that standpoint, I would say Christianity is a prerequisite for a durably free society. I emphasize that durably because I think you can sort of run on fumes for a while. I think a number of Western societies are sort of still running on fumes, but I think we're starting to see, what happens when those fumes run out.
Well, when you talk about limited government, that's a huge talking point. But it has to come, like you say, if you're going to limit government, you have to have a populace that can self-govern, that kind of moral self-mastery. And so it seems like what you're saying is that there's some pagan philosophers who picked up on this, and that, that you still could have a society that could, like you're saying, run on fumes. Like, I suppose if it was a classical pagan society and they know virtue's right and they want to pursue that, they just aren't able to maximize that or have that be durable because they don't possess the moral freedom that only a Christian uniquely possesses. And so you wouldn't be saying that in order to have an ordered society, everyone has to be a Christian, right? But that if you want it to be enduring, you need it to be a significant population of genuine Christians.
Yeah, well, right. There's two different things going on there, right? Which one would be, yes, having a significant proportion of people who are genuine Christians who actually enjoy that freedom in the Spirit and it shapes their lives. But there's also just at the level of ideas, and this is where I think, it's like a cultural Christianity can get you some ways, even if it's somewhat formalistic, which is at the level of ideas, one of the ways in which Christianity has made limited government possible and made political freedom possible is by disciplining the pretensions of the state, by saying, no, you can, earthly rulers are tasked with judgment, but there is a final judgment that they are not tasked with. Earthly rulers are tasked with cultivating virtue in their people, but they don't actually have the capacity to cultivate the truest virtue. And so civil government has an important job to do, but there's limits to what it can accomplish. And if it tries to do more than it actually can, it becomes an idol and it becomes oppressive and self-defeating. And so, for instance, just like very concretely here, I would say something, want to get controversial, well, probably not controversial to your listeners, but, the issue of reparations, I think is, at least broadly speaking, what you see there is this is an attempt to say there were these gross injustices that happened a couple centuries ago. We should do something about those. This injustice shall not stand. We need to do something about it. Well, who's going to do something about it? Well, I guess the government. I mean, who else is going to do something about it, right? Whereas as Christians, we can say, yes, this is a gross injustice. No, this injustice cannot stand. God is going to bring every injustice to light, and God is going to bring about the ultimate reparations. And because we know that, we don't have to figure out a way of doing it politically. But if you don't have that, then you're like, well, we need to find out a way to do it politically, and then you end up with this leviathan state that is trying to put all wrongs to rights.
Yeah, so often the cure is worse than disease in those instances whenever the state tries to be the arbiter of everything, and that can be devastating. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the Protestant Reformation, and it's funny. We've done some podcast interviews about the Reformation, and there's sort of the narrative of like the Reformation just ruined everything. That's why we have modernity. That's why we have all these horrible things happening in society, because the Reformation introduced radical individualism, total personal autonomy, all these types of things. But you talk about how actually the Protestant Reformation, specifically justification by faith, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier, is actually a very key insight into preserving genuine freedom. Can you talk about how we should understand the conception of freedom as it relates to the Reformation?
Yes. So, so that's where I, would talk about the chapter on spiritual freedom that I think, and I would say the distinction I make, the way I draw the distinction between spiritual freedom and moral freedom in chapters 2 and 3 is a particularly Protestant framing. There was a Catholic reader of the manuscript that was like, hey, it's like, this is, I couldn't quite endorse this way of putting it because this is not how we would talk about this as Catholics. That for them, the two would be much more closely interwoven, but Luther makes a sharp distinction between justification and sanctification, that there have to be these two kind of distinct moments. And the one is sort of freedom from the power, the condemnation of sin, the power of guilt that renders all of everything that we do feel futile and meaningless and hopeless, and liberated from that burden, then now we are set free for the task of growing in moral freedom, progressively being freed from the power of indwelling sin, right? So sin has both this function of condemnation and this function of kind of perverting our desires, right? So, and those have to be dealt with sort of at two different levels. I talk about the importance of that kind of prior, that freedom of a Christian that comes through the liberating word of justification as kind of the prerequisite for everything else. But it's important to note, of course, that although these are very distinct, they're held closely together. Luther, in one sentence, Luther says, right, the Christian is the most perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. The Christian is the most dutiful servant of all, subject to everyone. And so the freedom of justification immediately expresses itself in a service of the neighbor. And this is very consistent with New Testament language. So I say that, like, to be free is always to be in bondage to something. It's a question of whether you be in bondage to God, whether it be a bondservant for Christ for the neighbor, or whether you'll be in bondage to your own desires as those are manipulated by other people. So what Luther preaches is not an individualism, but really a kind of radical communitarianism in which the Christian expresses their freedom within the body of Christ by using their freedom. How can I love and serve my neighbor? And what you, in fact, when historians look at early modern Protestant polities, they're actually struck by not the degree of individualism and moral anarchy, but if anything, the opposite. But what historians complain about is that these were very, very, morally oppressive societies in which there were very strong community norms, and there was a lot of asceticism of mortifying your individual desires in order to be part of the godly community. And I mean, sometimes I think to a degree of overkill. I think some of our stereotypes of Puritans are misplaced. Some of the stereotypes can be fair in terms of these could be sort of morally oppressive communities. But whatever you can say about them, they weren't modern individualists. So there is a narrative. Ultimately, you do have to have some kind of narrative that sort of says, how did we get from there to where we are now? But I think it has more to do, it has a lot more to do with kind of epistemological considerations, which a lot of that is just technological, the unleashing of the printing press, the fact that, it's not like Luther didn't, Luther may have been the first one who really effectively used the printing press to create religious controversy among the literate public. But if Luther hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it, right? It was like this technology was here. It's this, like, we have the internet. This technology for mass communication was here. Human beings disagree about stuff. If people who disagree about stuff have a technology of mass communication, you're going to have mass disagreement, right? And then the kind of epistemological chaos that unleashes is what we've been sort of struggling with ever since. But the Reformation is sort of implicated in the rise of individualism in as much as everything downstream of the printing press is implicated in this. But when Luther talks about Christian liberty, that liberty is not an individualist idea of liberty. It's liberty to serve the neighbor.
Right, and like you're saying, it is a liberty. You think about Galatians, use your freedom to love one another, to serve each other, not for your own selfish gain. And it really is. I think today it's hard to even think about how Christianity or theology has anything to do with freedom. I think the average person thinks that it's, Christianity is about these rules and these norms, and you do these things, and you just like a killjoy and all these types of things. When in reality, it's actually the opposite. The freedom of your conscience to know that you're right before God and all those types of things are incredibly liberating things. And actually, I would argue, it seems like it actually enabled people to accomplish great goods because of that selflessness that should arise out of your justification. Now, you do talk about the American founding a little bit, and this was really because I feel like, man, I feel ignorant about a lot of this history, and so, but you do talk about the concept, especially of religious liberty, and that seems to be so tied to the American project. But today, that means something different, it seems like, than it meant maybe originally. So, can you talk a little bit about freedom and religious liberty, how we should think about that in light of our nation's history?
Yeah, a lot to say there. Of course, the first thing to say is that at the time of the founding, the First Amendment, which is a historical matter, was a restriction on Congress. It was not meant to be a restriction on the states. Some people did want absolute religious liberty in the states. Some people, though, supported the First Amendment because this was saying Congress can't meddle with the religious establishments that the states have. Right? Congress should make no law respecting an establishment of religion. There were establishments of religion in many states, and many of the founders thought that was a good thing. They didn't see establishment and religious liberty as necessarily contrary to each other. And I think people very often conflate these two now. They think, well, if you're for religious liberty, you have to be against religious establishment. And there's a couple reasons why people think that. One is, well, if you're a religious establishment means that people are being taxed. So, what exactly does a religious establishment mean? In basic terms, it can mean a lot of different things, but I think a sort of minimal part is public funds are used in some way to support the work of a denomination, right? So that means that taxpayers are in some way supporting religious work. Well, if you're a Baptist and the established church is Anglican, and then you're being taxed to support it, isn't that a violation of your religious liberty? Well, no. The short answer is no. Why? Because you're always going to be taxed to support some things you don't believe in. That's the nature of living in a society. Is You pay your taxes, and then other people decide what to do with them. And you do have some. You have some say. You vote for representatives, and you hope that you hope your funds will go to this rather than that. But at the end of the day, there's plenty of things your tax money is used for that you'd rather it weren't. And that doesn't constant. That just is the price of living in a society. That's not a violation of your. That shouldn't be seen as a violation of your conscience, at least up to a point, right? I think we might say there's if your taxpayer money were being used to, round up Jews in concentration camps or something like that, you're gonna that is a violation of my conscience at that level, right? But so that's one point. But I think more fundamental is what has changed since the founding is we have this idea. We've moved from an understanding of religious liberty as based upon toleration to being based upon affirmation. So I talk about this in a couple of places in the book where a framework of toleration says, we believe these things are true and good and should be promoted. But we understand that, people disagree and the world's an imperfect place and not everybody's going to be on board with this thing. And I could try to force everyone to get on board, but that would be bad and counterproductive or whatever. So I accept a situation where we promote these things, but we tolerate these other things, right? And you do that at any kind of level. I mean, right? Like a good university. I say good university. Like most modern universities don't really know what they believe in at all. But a healthy university will have a vision, an academic vision that it believes in and that it promotes. But it might tolerate a few, eccentric, heterodox scholars who kind of keep everybody on their toes a bit. But they're like, we don't really endorse what the guy says, but we let him teach here, right? So that's how religious liberty used to be understood, and how the founders kind of saw it, which is most of the founders would say we think Christianity is good and true and should be promoted, and the state should encourage it. But Jews are free to practice their religion, and that's fine. Now, the problem is that nowadays we think, well, that's just talk about tolerating something. That's really actually kind of offensive. I mean, because when you say tolerate, you're saying it's bad. You tolerate things that are bad, and so you're being judgmental. You're saying your religion is better than my religion. Well, that's not that's not acceptable. All religions have to be equally affirmed. If we're going to feel free, because we've kind of translated liberty into now it's this kind of like feeling, right? I want to feel free from any burden of judgmentalness, which means I need to feel like you fully affirm my beliefs, which means that religious liberty must mean that all religions have equal affirmation, right? Which is of course total nonsense. You can't equally affirm mutually contradictory statements about the true and the good, right? But I think that's kind of the incoherence into which, especially like kind of post 1950s thinking about religious liberty became.
Well, I think it's even, you can never really, it's not only become affirm, even the people want to affirm everything, they still have their doghouse of like, but you can't affirm these things.
Right, exactly, right. So then, and this is part of the point I made, right? So then a dominant religion is always operative,
right?
And it's just a question of how much you tolerate deviance, right? And the problem is that we've pretend that we no longer accept the idea of a publicly dominant religion, and what that just means is a new religion gets sneaked in through the back door and baptized under certain, politically correct language, and we say it's not a religion, but it really is.
And it is interesting, just the Christian ethic. I think it does provide the best conditions for a good, just kind of tolerance. I mean, even if you think about like love your enemies, there's that love component, but there's also a designation that they are opposed, right?
Yeah,
that they are, and so I think that Christianity is able to kind of hold that together. And, but yeah, I think it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. Like you think any kind of assertion of a Christian ethic in the public sphere, in the political sphere, it's like a knee-jerk, like religious liberty violation. Like there's alarms that go off. And it's interesting that that's sort of our knee-jerk reaction on, at least on a popular level.
Mm-hmm.
Now you talk about thinkers like Milton, Locke, Mill, some other guys, and people that I don't have a ton of familiarity with. I've heard them just in passing. But they're sort of these great thinkers in terms of freedom and personal liberty and all these types of things. But one of the comments you make is a lot of these thinkers who maybe they weren't necessarily Christian or would affirm that or anything like that, but they sort of assumed a traditional morality. And so it's one of those things where like their ideas percolate and it doesn't really ruin things because there's still this underbelly of Christian morality. And how should we think about those insights from Locke about personal freedom and liberty? Is it like they necessarily unravel into the sort of, licentiousness today? Or are there still like, yeah, no, they were right. It didn't have to end up this way. Or is it like they didn't realize that they were actually sawing off the branch that they sat on? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me use the sawing off the branch metaphor. A metaphor I was going to give. It's like they're leaning against a bookcase to try to scoot it over, in a sense, right? They're taking for granted. This is clear as with Mill. So Mill writes his whole treatise on liberty. I think it's the most significant text for understanding what we deal with today, because Mill is very clear. It's often sort of championed as this like great text about political liberty, but Mill is actually explicit. I'm not really talking about political liberty. He's like, we have plenty of political liberty in Britain, but we're still unfree. Why are we unfree? Because society, culture, Victorian morality is judgmental, and so people, even though they might technically be allowed to do something, they don't do it because they know they're going to be frowned upon, and that's not freedom. Freedom, So he's really explicit about like freedom means freedom from social pressure, right? Freedom to express yourself as an individual, but. The funny thing is, like, Mill himself is actually, he's a fairly, you look at Mill's personal life and what he actually valued, and it's a fairly traditional morality. And so, yeah, it's almost as if he's sort of taking for granted this whole cultural system morality, and he's leaning hard against it, knowing that it's there, and he just wants to nudge it over a bit, right? And it's like, you're leaning against a bookshelf, and the bookshelf suddenly disappears. What happens? You're going to fall over, right? So, I feel like that's what's happened with a lot of these thinkers. You could see similar things. You point out some things like in the arts or whatever, like movements that were kind of radically challenging the consensus of artistic standards or whatever. But in their minds, they were still kind of taking for granted a lot of that. And then then the 20th century comes along. Like, okay, sure, fine, we'll get rid of all the artistic standards. How do you like this splash of paint on a wall? Right? So, I mean, the way C.S. Lewis talks, well, he's actually not talking about this issue per se, but it applies to pretty much everything. Definitely applies to this issue. In Abolition of Man, he's talking about technology, and he says I quote this in the book in the chapter on technology, that it's like the famous joke about the Irishman's two stoves. There was a certain Irishman who discovered that with a new kind of stove, he could reduce his heating bill by half. And so he then concluded that if he got two such stoves, he wouldn't have to pay anything at all. Right. So, and I think the growth of modern liberty in many fora kind of is like this, like in freedom of speech or freedom of religion, or economic freedom. It was sort of like we took all these pre-modern constraints and we said, what if we loosened this a bit? Maybe it would make things better. And sort of like we said, we turn the dial. I'm sort of mixing metaphors here a lot, whatever. Loosen, turn the dial, whatever. But anyway, we're gonna loosen things up a bit, and it's like, oh wow, hey, it's this is great. The more freedom of speech is leading to more. We have a more vigorous public debate, more voices in the conversation, sharpening of ideas. Okay, it's great. Let's if going halfway helped this much, then going all the way is going to help even more, right? And then quite often that's not the case. Quite often going the whole way undoes all the benefits you just had, right? So, like freedom of speech, you kind of removing the obstacles for intelligent, informed contributors to the conversation is great. That enlivens and invigorates the conversation. Removing the obstacles for absolutely anybody to participate in a conversation makes conversation impossible, right? With freedom of religion, I think it's like, it's one thing to say, okay, if Christianity is the dominant religion, but we allow more different expressions of Christianity, let's let the Baptists have a try or whatever, right? Or if you say, Christianity is the dominant religion, but we're going to allow, we're perfectly happy to have a society that has, some Muslim immigrants and Jewish immigrants and so on. And hey, that actually seems to be working fine. Does that mean that a society that had 100 different religions that each made up 1% of the population would be the best of all? No, it doesn't mean that, right? So I think it's a lot of what you see with the thinkers like Locke and Mill is making important, challenging some established norms in ways that it could actually be helpful in a number of ways, but then mistakenly thinking that just keep on pushing in the same direction will keep producing more and more good results. And that's just not how the world works.
But where is the stop? Because I think that's the hard part where you're like, okay, it's good that Baptists aren't being persecuted. How do you make an arbitrary stop that doesn't go into like, okay, well, now we celebrate every single religion as if it's totally equal and you don't have a dominant religion or anything like that? Or freedom of speech where you're like, I'm glad that people can express their thoughts about the government freely or something like that without it becoming unmoored. Where does the stop come? Because I think some people, I can imagine you could be like, well, maybe you shouldn't have turned the dial at all. We should turn the dial all the way back. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's not something that you can come. There's an a priori rule that will tell you. It is something. It's a matter of kind of political experimentation, and but I think to the extent that you have a guiding principle is, let's start with the question of, all right, tolerate. Like, let's just say toleration of Baptists, then toleration of then Mormons, and then Muslims. Okay, let's kind of do that progression. So the reformers, the Protestant tradition of thinking about religious toleration starts from the understanding that while our theological beliefs do shape our politics, not all of our theological beliefs shape our politics the same way, or so there are because our politics is, as we said, concerned with a limited set of issues. Politics should be concerned with a limited set of issues, achieving certain limited earthly goods, which means that quite a number of theological principles will be not relevant or only minimally relevant to political deliberation. And so for instance, we would say that an understanding of human beings as created in the image of God is a very politically relevant principle that is going to inform,
right. Yeah,
that informs how you apply the law, thou shalt not murder. And now it turns out all Christians agree on that. The Baptists and Catholics don't disagree on that. And certainly Baptists and Anglicans don't disagree on that. So the question of when should you baptize an infant or should you baptize a believer doesn't actually affect your politics. Now, I know someone could make the argument, well, and I think, that in as much as Baptist theology is based upon a kind of individual consent rather than sort of receiving something on the basis of authority, therefore Baptist theology does actually shape a kind of liberal politics, whether for good or for ill, in a way of encouraging a more consensual rather than traditional form of political order, right? So I think that's true, but it's also not absolute at all. I think it's perfectly possible to hold together a Baptist theology and say, look, we're saying this about baptism. We're saying that when it comes to baptism, the individual has to consent, but that doesn't mean that we think that consent is the determines everything, and there's no such thing as tradition and authority. So all that to say, the theological differences between Baptists and other forms of Christians turns out don't actually have, in modern society at least, significant policy-related consequences. Now, with Mormons, they did, because Mormons held to polygamy, and other Christians didn't, and that's an important matter of public policy. What counts as marriage? And so, basically, the United States said, "Look, you want to be part of the United States. We are all for religious liberty and such, but you can't. You can believe what you want in your heart about polygamy, but you can't do it, right?" So, when the Mormons sort of agreed, okay, we're not going to insist on the polygamy thing, then we found actually the Mormons have a lot of weird beliefs, but they don't actually have. Most of them don't arise to the level of things that have important impacts on public policy. With Islam, though, we start to get into territory where the beliefs are different enough that they shape a very different philosophy of law, a very different understanding of the purpose of the state in a way that is not like the kind of separation of church and state that we've been able to develop in the West that are consistent with Christian theology don't work as well with Muslim theology, right? So I think you can say the theological differences actually have important political impacts. So this is long-winded answer, but this is just sort of showing your question of where are the brakes on it? If you allow some religious toleration, why not all of it? Well, although you may not be able to define a priori in advance, you can sort of look and say, okay, to what extent does this religious diversity actually introduce problems at the level of the things that we agree are the task of civil government? Now, but I'll just note, then I'll finally shut up with this long-winded answer, right? I said, to what extent do they interfere with what we agree is the task of civil government? Well, in that statement, what we agree is the task of civil government is itself the product of a certain theological heritage.
Right.
And as I just said, like Muslims wouldn't necessarily agree about what is the task of civil government. So there is, and to some extent, what we think the task of civil government is the product of a kind of Protestant consensus that has shaped American life. And that as long as that's the kind of unspoken consensus, we can allow for a lot of religious diversity. But at some point, if you throw that out the window, then you're not going to be able to have the same kind of society anymore.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it's a prudential consideration about cohesion in society, and I think it is sort of, you're like, okay, there are certain core differences that would be destabilizing in all these areas. I don't want to get you in trouble. Maybe I do, but where do Roman Catholics fit into this? Because it's interesting thinking about Roman Catholic theology. It does have a quasi-political tone to it.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, Catholicism works in America because Catholicism has Protestantized. And shouldn't be controversial to say, I was just in an event last night where Rusty Reno said exactly this. As a Catholic, he said, Catholicism is able to be a major part of American public life now because Catholicism in America has Protestantized. And I mean, I think that's particularly true of Catholicism in America.
Yeah.
Where just like has culturally adopted a lot of the frameworks of Protestantism. Catholics in America tend to be much more into reading their Bibles, for instance, than Catholics in other parts of the world. So kind of evangelical spirituality has fed in. But going back behind that, at the level of political theology, there were key shifts that were made, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, where the Catholic Church said, we are basically changing our teaching on political theology, and we are no longer saying that the Pope's spiritual authority confers on the Pope any kind of temporal authority. Now, before they did that, it was simply not the case that you could say, oh, we can have total religious freedom for Catholics and it won't affect anything. Because, in England, they were like, look, the Catholics wanted to blow up Parliament, the Guy Fawkes plot. Now, obviously, not all the Catholics wanted to blow up Parliament, but some of them did, and they thought that they had a religious duty to blow up Parliament, and they thought they had a religious duty to lie to any authorities who questioned them, because their fundamental duty was toward the Pope, and he could tell them where their political obedience lay. And so the English were like, look, we're not religious bigots here. I mean, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but they were like, look, we're not trying to be religious bigots. We're just saying can't allow people in the country that are, loyal to a foreign prince. And so Roman Catholicism actually had to change its political theology before it was compatible with Protestant polities. And I think there's absolutely no problem. I don't think there's any problem now with. I would love it if there were more Catholics in America. Given the alternatives, but I do think we'd be naive to think that we shouldn't take that and be like, oh well, our stupid, benighted ancestors who just couldn't handle Roman Catholics. And now we're so much more tolerant and enlightened. No, it's like, no, the circumstances have changed. Catholicism has changed. The conflict that was once there isn't there anymore.
That's fascinating. I mean, it is true. There's a form of assimilation that allows for that cohesion, essentially. I mean, if they Protestantize, and I think even it's probably on a more minor level, even when you think about, Muslim expressions of faith today, it's in America, they're largely westernized. I mean, it's not, you're not very rarely do you have like tried and true, like all, fundamentalist, kind of how it is. And so I think that we sort of had this intuition that a certain amount of assimilation needs to be there. I want to go back to technology. And this is, I think, was a really key part of your book, the impact of technology on our sense of freedom. And you've touched on this a little bit, but how would you say, how would you explain to somebody the way that technology has impacted our sense of freedom? I mean, you mentioned just democratizing discourse, good and bad with that. But yeah, how should we think as Christians about the way that technology impacts our freedom?
Yeah, so huge topic, but just say a couple things. Throughout the book, I'm making the case that freedom has to operate within constraint. That you are, I give the example. I don't know if I get this in the book. A bowling ball. If you're really bad at bowling, then it's good to have the bumpers up, because you bowl the ball and it bounces back and forth, and the bumpers actually guide it toward its destination. And that's a good metaphor for all of us. We're really bad at life. We're sinners, and we're just going to zigzag all over the place. And so it's good to have some constraints that keep us actually roughly going in the right direction. And that's the role of law. Law in all senses. So natural law as well as divine law, as well as human law. And so to live in a world of constraints, to live in a world of which there's laws of nature, there's the actual like physical laws, and then there's also moral laws, is actually good for us and good for our freedom. Now, the task of throughout the ages, technology has been sort of trying to reduce the extent to which the world pushes back upon our will, right? I mean, it's like, just think of it, Adam's trying to, dig a ditch, and it's hard work to dig a ditch, because the world is pushing back. But if he's got a steam shovel, it's just, it's a heck of a lot easier. So throughout, every advance of technology is a way of making it where if we want something, it's easier to get it. There's less pushback from our environment. And I think this is where the Irishman's two stoves, and this is the context in which I invoke it, where the principle comes in, which is up to a point that is actually quite enhancing of freedom, because there are plenty of things. Because, like we would say, before modern times, people had to spend so much time and effort, just like, okay, I'm building a structure to keep out the elements. Okay, build the structure. Okay, now I'm collecting firewood. Okay, now killing the animal. Just trying to stay alive. It's just like that they never could get to anything else, right? They could never get to to be able to make a violin and then master a violin and then compose a violin concerto and so on. Like, you can't do that if you're just trying to collect firewood and kill a deer and eat it all the time. So this is, I think it's like the 19th century. If we were to take this kind of maybe theory of history, is like the first of the Irishman stove that cut his fuel bill by half. Maybe that was like the 19th century was that kind of sweet spot where we actually see the maximal flowering of culture. And it's just extraordinary. If music, literature, whatever you're into, like all the great composers, all the great novelists, it's like they're in the 19th century. So without painting with too broad a brush, I think there's this extent to which we had used technology to free us from the constraints of our natural environment enough that we were now freed to pursue the higher forms of what it means to be human. But then there's the point of diminishing returns, where you use technology to so overcome those constraints. There's really no constraints at all. It's like, and the most extreme form of this, at least that we've thought of so far, is like what Elon Musk wants to do with Neuralink, which is like, I got a little chip in my brain, and it's like all I have to do is think up a tweet, and boom, the tweet appears, right? Like, how is that good for the world, right? It's too easy. It's way too easy to tweet as it is. If there was there's already no filter. So the total absence of constraints in the digital realm, the ability for me just to will something and make it happen, pull up any image I want, move on to something else, is actually, we're the bowling ball with no bumpers now, right? And we zigzag and go into the what do they call them? I guess the ditches,
the
gutters. Thank you. And yes, so yes, so that's kind of the theory of technology that I'm giving in the book.
So is the issue in the technology itself that it gives us this unbridled freedom, or is it the issue in a lack of virtue in ourself to control it? Or, I'm sure it's perhaps a mix of both. But
yeah. Well, right. So there's always a feedback loop with technology, which is to say, we invest in those technologies that kind of give us what we already want to some extent, right? So technologies arise out of a culture, and as a culture that valued a certain form of freedom that created the technologies that we now have. However, once those technologies enter into widespread use and condition us to live in accord with them, they also further shape us in that direction. And so we just want more and more and more of them. So, just like, here's a simple example of this, is like, so we're impatient society. And so we said, we want faster internet. We want broadband, not dial-up. Well, then as we get used to everything being faster, then it gets harder and harder to be patient. And there's actually been studies on this that have shown over the years, like, what is, how long will people wait for a web page to load before they're like, to heck with this, right? And it gets less and less and less each year. It's like, now it's down to like, what's 1.2 seconds? I'm out of here, yes. So the technology arises out of a set of values, but then it reinforces those values by habituating us to expect certain things. And so once we've gotten into that feedback loop, it can require once you're within the feedback loop, you can't just say, well, we're just gonna use this more virtuously. Just gonna try to just use more self-control. You might have to do things that feel rather radical, to kind of rewire your expectations for, like, I should not be in the mindset of instant gratification. So, what does that mean? I think I think that is something that we can't do as individuals. Really, all these technologies are social technologies. All the digital technologies designed to connect us with other people. We've increasingly made all sorts of aspects of our lives together mediated through these devices. Therefore, reclaiming self-mastery is something that we will have to do as communities, not just as individuals. And that's where I think, things like schools saying as a school, we're not having any phones on campus or whatever, that's an exercise of what I call collective or corporate liberty. An exercise of corporate liberty that is ultimately in defense of individual liberty. You might not have the liberty to bring your phone to school, but you're actually going to have the more important liberty to learn and socialize with your classmates and so on.
And that goes back to your individual liberty, corporate liberty, freedom conception, where you might have the self-mastery of your phone, but you can still say, I'm going to give that up because this is good for my fellow man, right? These are good for my students and good for the school. And so I'm willing to give up this liberty, even if I have the ability to handle it for the sake of this common good. And you're right. You can't just like flex the virtue muscle and just be like, now I'm moderating. A lot of times you have to, in a sense, overcorrect. And you're right. I mean, it's hard when so much of society runs on social media and this interconnectivity that it would take a collective movement to really kind of dial back some of the excesses. You can't, you're kind of hamstrung if it's just yourself.
Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, obviously we're having this conversation,
but we're doing it virtuously. We're doing this virtuously and with moderation.
Yes,
and
doing the virtual virtuously.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'd love to get your thoughts just as we kind of get to a close about, where do we go from here? Because we do live in a pluralistic society. I mean, we do live in, technology's here, everything's, you can't unscramble the egg, right? So how can Christians think about moving forward in a pluralistic age? How do we kind of pave the way forward in terms of the betterment of society and even just the health of our churches? This is just the reality. It's a diverse, multicultural society.
Right. Well, I think, so I want to push back on, I think, there can be this fatalism that's like, look, this is, all these things you're talking about, maybe it's a shame that we've ended up where we are, but what are we going to do about it? And I want to push back and say, like, a lot of these issues where we have gone too far, past, we have two stoves and we need just one stove. A lot of them are going to take a lot of work to undo the excess, but in many cases we haven't even tried, and we don't even try because we don't even give ourselves permission to think about trying. And what do I mean by that? Well, we'll talk about it in the church sphere and then in the political sphere. So in the church sphere, I think, again, this is where bad concepts hamstring our ability to act faithfully and intelligently, where we say, if a church tries to go about saying, you know what, we need to really cultivate communal rhythms again. We need to think in terms of corporate liberty rather than individual liberty. And what does it mean for us to do these things as the body of Christ and to together exercise this form of asceticism? And that could be, we could be talking about something like the church calendar, where we say we're going to go through and observe a period of time of fasting together. We could just be talking about within the liturgy itself. I think the asceticism, the corporate liberty of observing an ordered liturgy, as opposed to just kind of the sort of much more freewheeling, do what feels good evangelical worship. Any attempt in that direction is often met with, well, you're messing with my Christian liberty. This is like, you can't tell me to that we should fast. I'll decide if I should fast. I'll decide when I should fast, which basically means never, right? So now the issue of fasting is this was a controversy in the Reformation. Could the rejection of Lenten fasting, but crucially, when the reformers were like they were not against communal disciplines, but they were against overinflated theological claims for those communal disciplines, saying this God requires this, or this is meritorious for salvation or whatever. No, you don't want to say any of that. But you could say this is very effective for formation and virtue, and so we're all going to do this. And to say that is not a violation of Christian liberty as the reformers understood it. So I think there are a lot of things that we could do in our churches to recover a healthier practice of liberty if we could get rid of this distorted concept where we say, oh, you can't do that, violation of Christian liberty. Similarly, in the political realm, I think we have this like whacked out notion of so an area I'm working in right now is, so very concretely, something I'm working on right now, this should be the day after I think this podcast is released, there will be a Supreme Court case against the Free Speech Coalition versus the state of Texas. And the Free Speech Coalition is arguing that it is a violation of adults' freedom of speech to be required to prove their age before accessing hardcore pornography websites. Right? It's not just saying it would be a violation of their freedom of speech to allow them to access them. It's a violation of their freedom of speech to even have to prove their age. Right. So this is an attempt to just like take a really basic common sense step to protect children. That the case, we'll see which way it goes. They have a decent chance of winning the case because we've adopted a certain bizarre interpretation of the First Amendment that basically says any limitations, any burdens whatsoever upon any form of speech, which speech is now defined in like really capacious terms, is constitutionally unacceptable, right? And so, therefore, because of this bad legal doctrine, we haven't even attempted a lot of policies, right? There are lots and lots of things that we could do to reduce the worst effects of technology, especially on children, which is the most important because that's when you form your basic habits of mind, is in childhood. So there are plenty of things that we could do that would work fairly well. And we just haven't even tried them because we're like, well, we're not allowed to do that because that would be a violation of freedom of speech, right? So that's where I think getting our concepts right then gives us permission to actually take the kinds of actions that could enable us to develop a healthier balance of individual and corporate freedom.
Well, I think that's why your book is very helpful in defining those terms. What would you say? What is the good intuition behind like Christians should stay out of politics? Is there a sense in which we should be? I know there's a lot of pushback against this, but is there a good sense in which it's like, okay, but we don't want to be so, focused on the affairs of this life? What is the good? Is there a good intuition of that, or how should we formulate it in a way that it doesn't become a sort of ultimate passivity? Yeah.
Well, I think there's at least two good instincts there, right? One is we should be wary of the way in which, as Calvin says, our heart is a factory of idols, and politics is one of the biggest idols of all, and that we're often pulled into it by the sense of there is this injustice in the world, this needs to be corrected, and there is an injustice in the world, and it does need to be corrected. But guess what? God is going to correct it. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't do anything to try and correct it, right? We're not pacifists. We say, look, God is going to punish, the Nazi aggressor, but you're allowed to exercise some temporal punishment on the Nazi aggressor too. In the meantime, it does mean that the knowledge of divine judgment chastens our expectations for what we're trying to accomplish with earthly justice and enables us to take a more detached approach. I talk about we need to have a posture of detached engagement. We engage in the political realm because it's a means of loving our neighbor, but we do so with a kind of inner detachment, trusting that, God's going to sort this out. I'm not going to sort this out. However, but I'm going to be faithful and trust God to sort it out. So I think there's a healthy impulse there for a kind of detachment, but the detachment needs to nonetheless be a detached engagement. The other thing I think that is a healthy impulse is saying, you have strong convictions about things, but those strong convictions don't necessarily strong convictions at the level of principle do not tell you what political practice should necessarily look like, right? As we said, there's this huge realm of prudence in terms of what does it actually mean to live out these principles in this particular time and place. And Christians are sometimes tempted to think, because I'm a Christian and the Bible tells me the answers, and I'm going into the public square armed with all of these Bible principles or this biblical worldview, or whatever, and so I know what the proper approach to trade policy is. It's like no, no, you don't.
Right.
You could have a Christian that you agreed on everything theologically and had very different views on trade policy, right? So that there is a sense in which we need to be careful about while faithful Christians should engage in politics, they shouldn't necessarily confuse their faith with their politics, in the sense that there will be many aspects of political life that are underdetermined, by Scripture and by Christian tradition, and we need to be able to be okay with that uncertainty, and not try to sort of short circuit the conversation by an appeal to Scripture.
Well, that's part of knowing our limits too. I mean, I think you got to know the limitations of your ability to enact justice, so that you don't become, your worst enemy. And I just think that there's so much that's helpful when we talk about freedom in this particular way, because I do think I think, most millennials grew up, it's like you can be anything. And now I think everyone's like, just, I need to know what to be. It's almost because everything is open to me that I want a path. Yep. I want restraint. And I think there's sort of a sense in our culture of even wanting that. But this was a great discussion, Brad. I appreciate the time you're spending in this book. Comes out January 15th. Make sure you pick that up. And I think it'll be a helpful resource for people in the church and just anyone who's interested in this topic in general. So, Brad, I want to thank you for being on the show and for taking part in all this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.